Samurai Shodown, released in 1993 on the Neo-Geo MVS, the first in its genre to outclass any other fighting game with weapons, and a roster of characters as memorable as Street Fighter II. In this video, we'll delve into this best-in-class weapons fighting game and see how well the console ports stood up to the arcade version. What is up, gamer fam, and welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at Samurai Shodown on arcade versus console. Please do me a favor before we get deep into this video. Please give that like button a click, and if you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. Otherwise, share this video with somebody who you know would absolutely love this. For those of you that don't know, Samurai Shodown is a fighting game, a weapons-based fighting game. In Japan, it's known as Samurai Spirits. One of the cool things about it is that it's set in 18th century Japan, and all of the characters utilize weaponry in one way or another. When this game was released in 1993, I remember playing it at my friend's, well, his parents owned a Shakey's Pizza, and we played it there all the time. And then when it was eventually ported to console and handheld, we had the SNES, Game Boy version, and I had the Game Gear and Sega Genesis version. Now every kid back then wanted the 3DO version because it had scaling just like the arcade. One of the things that made this game so big was its innovative gameplay style. It was critically acclaimed for this. So there was approximately 11 ports of this game. And what a game to port. There were so many different variables depending on which system you played it on. I mean, if you played it on the 16-bit consoles, you didn't get scaling. If you played it on the 32-bit consoles, you did get scaling, but you had loading times. And even Neo Geo CD had loading on it. You would have thought that was a perfect arcade port, right? Now, there was also the other less notable port. When I say less notable, I mean after its time. So they're all really great ports and good packages. In fact, I own Anthology on my PSP, and I own a couple of other variants of it, like the online arcade version for Xbox. But my point is, today we're going to be going over the console ports of that time. I pretty much played every single one of that time during that time frame, and I'm going to play them again for this video and to have fun and to kind of get that feel back and let you know which console version I think is the best of Samurai Shodown. So let's get into this video and let's deep dive in to all the differences in the console version and the arcade version, but not before we see a cringy commercial from the 90s. Maybe not so cringy this time, or maybe really cringy.
100 Mega Shock Neo-Geo!
剣と共に生き、剣と共に死ぬ定め。金ネオジオサムライスピリッツ
SNK. Yup! Yup!
切り捨て5面の剣術アクション Super Famicom Samurai Spirits.
You guys smell that? It's the smell of nostalgia. This whole video isn't going to be about system specs, but there are a few important things that I do want to point out. The Sega Genesis and the Neo Geo had some important similarities, one of them being the Motorola 68000 processor. While the Sega had a much lower clock speed, the Sega CD brought that up to about 12.5 MHz. Although one of the other major limiting factors was the color palette of the Sega Genesis. Comparatively, the SNES had a much less powerful CPU until you start looking into things more, but it did have a better color palette as well. Throw DSP and a few other custom CPU features in there, and it just made it a much different architecture than the Sega Motorola architecture. With that being said, I guess my point is that the Sega Genesis was built to deliver more of an arcade experience at home. When comparing it to a Neo Geo, of course it seems underpowered, but with the Sega CD, even though it didn't pack as much of a punch, it was still pretty good for a home console at the price point. Here's the Sega CD version of Samurai Shodown next to the Super Nintendo version of the game. While the Super Nintendo appears to have a nicer color palette, the Sega CD actually looks closer visually to the arcade version. Now, when exploring 32-bit options, the 3DO was priced similarly at the time to the AES system. And while the Neo Geo couldn't compete with the 3DO's ARM processor, which allowed it to process 3D graphics, it was somehow incapable of parallax scrolling. This was a feature that even the Sega Genesis could do. Parallax scrolling is essentially background images moving past the camera more slowly than the images in the foreground. This creates the illusion of depth in a moving 2D scene. However, that doesn't fully detract from the fact that the 3DO was a very powerful system during its time, and gave players an opportunity to experience one of the best ports of Samurai Shodown. Keep in mind, any disc version of the game during this time period was going to have loading, including the Sony PlayStation. The Sega CD's loading times were probably the longest loading times out of all your options, between the 3DO, the Neo Geo CD systems, and the Sony PlayStation. Although the Sony PlayStation version did not come out until later and was only available in Japan. All things considered, the Sega CD version was still a beautiful port from the arcade, with only one character omitted, that being Earthquake. The gameplay and latency feels more like the arcade version than the Super Nintendo or 3DO version in my opinion. And this is certainly due in part to the architecture of the Motorola 6800 system that it was built on. As we slide over here to the Sega Genesis version or Mega Drive version of Samurai Shodown, consider the fact that we're going from a 12.5 MHz processor to a 7.5 MHz processor, and additionally a loss in the fullness of the color palette. Even with this underpowered system, the game still looks and feels more like the arcade in my opinion. But now you have to take into consideration that the music really sucks compared to the Sega CD version, and it's not that great when you compare it to the Super Nintendo version either. But again, if your main concern is arcade-style visuals and the speed and accuracy of the arcade, then it's still there in the Sega Genesis version. Before I forget, the Sega CD version did have a fatal bug where when you get to the last boss, the game will crash sometimes. Of course, with the game being on CD, the bug was never fixed. Looking at the Super Nintendo Super Famicom version here, there's a couple things to note. One is you have the bars on the top and bottom of the screen. This is a cause of the resolution and the fact that it was scrolled all the way out. It was definitely more colorful than the Sega CD or the Sega Genesis version. However, the sound effects and the gameplay weren't quite as smooth. So as it stands, this version had a complete character roster, a nicer color palette, and compared to the Genesis, it definitely had better music. The controls work fine and are responsive, but personally, I prefer the more snappy Genesis or Sega CD version over this one. For the educational purposes of this video, I am going to play the handheld versions on my RG35XX. The Game Gear version of Samurai Shodown was actually really cool. It was the only handheld colored version of the game. While 3 characters were omitted, they did manage to leave most of the good ones in there, at least the ones that I appreciated. If we're talking purely from an arcade perspective, this handheld version was probably the most arcade accurate as far as the visuals and the gameplay. The sound was pretty good for a Game Gear. They did their best to accurately reproduce the sprites and shrink them down to a very small screen size for the Game Gear experience. Again, for being tailored to the system's capabilities, I think that they did a pretty good job for what they had at the time. The Game Boy version was somewhat of an enigma because while it was a port of the arcade version, they really made it the Game Boy's own. What made it especially unique was that they added in all this different artwork as well as a story for each character, and instead of using the full-size, full-sprite characters, actually took more of a pocket character approach. Before pocket fighters were really a big thing. On a quick side note, it really makes me wish that they would have taken this type of approach with Street Fighter 2. While it's not quite the arcade version, it feels like you're playing Samurai Shodown, and it's a smooth experience. The music's great, the sound effects are cool, and the sprites look really beautiful on the dot matrix screen. Overall, the refaced Game Boy port is a really fantastic way to play this game, one of the best at the time for sure. While the Neo-Geo Pocket came out later and had more of a remixed approach to the game itself, it was still cool and worth a mention. Neo-Geo Pocket really did bring about a smooth experience for pocket fighting games, and that was one of the things that I appreciated the most about it, especially as a fighting game enthusiast. While the first version of this release was in black and white, the second version was in color. While this is an official version of Samurai Shodown licensed by SNK, it's definitely a remix more than a port. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Let's take a look at a couple of interesting facts from SNK Wiki about the ported versions of this game. I found it very interesting that only the cartridge ports were handled by Takara, while Crystal Dynamics handled the 3DO, which was totally common, and JVC did the Sega CD version. As you can see in this article, it talks about the Sega CD bug. Consequently, instead of fixing it, because realistically they didn't want to spend the money on it, they offered people a free copy of Fatal Fury Special. Even in this article, it points out that the SNES version's zoomed out screen actually did make it more difficult to time your attacks correctly. Unfortunately, this game came out during the time that Mortal Kombat was very popular, and censorship was becoming a big thing. So every port that went to console, even AES, which technically isn't a port, had noticeably dialed down levels of violence. This was especially dependent on what region you were in when it came to systems like the AES, ultimately creating a market for Neo Geo mod chips. This is our mystery port. If you haven't seen one of these before, it's called an FM Towns console. This was only released in Japan and something that was comparable to a 3DO, PC Engine CD, or Amiga 32 CD. And while I've never actually played this port of the game, it looks pretty impressive for what it is. And just to throw it out there, this is not being emulated. It's actually being captured from the system. I'm not entirely sure of its hardware limitations, but overall it looks like it plays the game pretty well. Let's take a look here and you guys tell me what you think. Did you know that this port even existed? It's kind of wild that the quality of the port is so well done, and to be honest, I hadn't heard of this version. I've heard of the FM Towns before, but I had no idea that Samurai Shodown was ever released on it. I'm very curious to hear what your guys' opinions are about this game, and whether or not you preferred one port more than another. While most of the ports lack something that didn't allow them to reach the full potential of the arcade version, there were a few good ones. It's also worth mentioning that load times on the Neo Geo CD-Z were pretty fast, and the port also included an arranged version of the soundtrack. Which version is my favorite? Well, I'm gonna have to go with the Sega CD version. While it may be considered more of a peasant version, to me, the speed and the responsiveness of the Sega CD version was what I favored over any other version. Yes, the loading time sucked and Earthquake was omitted, but I couldn't argue with the snappy gameplay, and not to mention that the CD audio soundtrack was ripped right from the arcade and sounded fantastic. To me, this version of the game felt the most like the arcade. Now, of course, my favorite version is the arcade version, which I now have the privilege of owning. And thanks to emulation, most of us can get that experience as well. Let me know which version you prefer and why down in the comments. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our journey for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this. Samurai Shodown is one of those games that if you have not played it, I would highly recommend checking it out, especially if you're into fighting games. And there's just something almost perfect about the first and second Samurai Shodown. Not that the other ones after it weren't as good. The way the first two were built, the art style, everything about them, I guess it's the most nostalgic period for me. But let me know what your experience is with Samurai Shodown down in the comments. And until next time, I'll see you guys then.